Thank you very much, Lorraine. I'm very happy to introduce Glenn to everyone on the call with us today. Glenn is a multi-instrumentalist and a PhD candidate in ethnomusicology at Memorial University. For the past decade, he's worked with the English-speaking minority of the Gaspé Coast to archive and share the musical heritage of that region, and much of which has been shared through home recordings made between, I guess, the late 1950s and the early 2000s. The music has been shared through 2 blogs and an ethnographic CD co-produced with fiddler and musicologist Laura Risk and the Douglas Community Center in the Eastern Gaspé. At QAHN, we're really excited about a project that Glenn is currently working with us on. It's entitled A Different Tune, Musical Heritage in English-Speaking Quebec. And with the help of community organizations across the province, this project is documenting and sharing the diverse musical cultures of the English-speaking Quebecers, and well, both rural and urban. And the project is built on the guiding notion that participation in our musical cultures is a crucial ingredient in the vitality of our communities. So without saying anything more, I'll turn the floor back over to you, Lorraine.
Just to say, take it away, Glenn.
There you go.
Thank you, Lorraine. Thank you, everyone. Great to see so many QAHN friends here today. Great, feel really supported. I was really glad, thanks to Lorraine for inviting me to do this. The other week, Anna Hunt at QUESCREN did a sort of an interview with me about my research and asked me some questions, which sort of got me thinking about a few issues, sentiments I've felt for a few years, but haven't had a chance to put into words and make sort of a coherent argument with. So with that inspiration, and given the great job Dorothy did the other week presenting her paper, I thought I'd do something a little more formal and slightly academic, which isn't really my thing these days, but I felt like upping my game a bit or just doing something a bit different. So it'll be a little bit academic, but we'll talk about music in these English-speaking communities, and watch some videos, and maybe I'll even play a tune at the end. But I thought we would start, again, this came up in the interview with Anna, was the sort of theme about how we think about the English-speaking communities of Quebec in terms of research. QUESCREN is a research network. Like, what sort of knowledge do we have about the community? What knowledge is formalized in terms of research and that sort of stuff? And I think my observations, and of course QUESCREN has this great bibliography, I'd say a lot of the research is demographic in nature. It deals with demographic trends like outmigration. There's quite a bit about regional differences as you traverse the province and the histories of those regions. A lot of economic histories, for example, sort of, maybe these are a bit cliche now, but Scottish merchants, Irish laborers on the Lachine Canal, black railway porters. We have histories of institutions. A lot of these institutions, I would say, are kind of associated with an Anglophone elite, especially in Montreal, but elsewhere as well. Also, things like healthcare, access, and outcomes. All that to say is, what we don't see a lot in the research is an attention to what I would call expressive culture. What are the expressive cultural practices of English speakers across Quebec? And what role do these practices play in the dynamics of the community? So, for example, when I think of expressive culture, we might be thinking about visual art, music, literary arts, and these could be both vernacular and formal. How do these sort of expressive cultural practices impact our sense of belonging and attachment to our communities? Or what role do these arts have in fostering a sense that we have a unique history in our regions, in our cities, in the province, or even in Canada as a whole? So I guess what I'm trying to achieve in this talk is to argue that we take our musical cultures in English-speaking Quebec seriously as an important force in the production and reproduction of our communities. I want to describe in particular the role music can play and what sociologists might call the production of senses of place and collective belonging. So this is where I get a bit academic. I would say my goal as an applied ethnomusicologist more generally in working with community groups is to sort of help community leaders, institutions, and the general public just be a bit more thoughtful and intentional about how they think about the role of musical culture in their communities and how maybe it can be leveraged to promote and strengthen community vitality. There are, however, as I see it, a number of challenges to making this kind of argument that music matters, that music is important. And I would say some of this isn't, necessarily just symptomatic of the English-speaking community. I would say Western culture in general has a long history of sort of trivializing musicians and the people who make it. We see it as entertainment, a diversion from real life. Even my own family, my dad sitting me down when I was 16 and telling me there's no way I was going to school to study music, which I didn't. I went and became an engineer for 11 years, but really the sense that music it's not real work. It's somehow it's adjacent to real life. Maybe it's a frill, it's a frivolity. And I think part of this is also correlates with class. I came from my dad started in the working class, but moved his way up into white collar work. And I think a lot of these values are sort of what I call sort of middle class values. But that way of thinking about music and musicians isn't universal if you look at a cross-cultural perspective. For example, the griot, sort of the poet bards in West African cultures, these musician storytellers are incredibly important people in their society. They contain often the majority of the collective memory of that community, its stories of its great families, of its achievements. In Middle Eastern and Eastern cultures more generally, you have this idea of the Hoja, the master musician, and great honor is conferred upon these people. So all that to say is how musicians and music are sort of perceived in a society just varies with culture. A lot can be said about all this stuff, and it's not always straightforward, including in those other cultures that I mentioned there. I would say another force that's very prevalent and I would say mostly detrimental is the idea that music is a commodity. It's something that can be extracted from the people that play it and the cultures that produced it. It's simply just a set of sounds that we can record and sell to unseen and distant consumers on a national or global scale. So pop music industry is obviously the embodiment of this. But again, it's not always straightforward. Just as an example, I would say humans, including English-speaking Quebecers, are very good at appropriating music from the radio, TV, just commercial culture, and imbuing it with deep personal and collective meanings that are attached to their families, their communities. So I don't want to give the impression that I think pop music is unhealthy or something, but just that the economics of that industry sometimes can be a bit anathema to promoting, I would say, more healthy values about why music is important, what its role is in our communities. So with that, I think where I'm kind of going with this is to take a view of music that's sociological. Think about it, maybe a sociology of music, how people in societies make and disseminate and appropriate their music and the implications this has on these societies. So it works at many levels. It's a richly layered set of interactions that implicates individuals, peer groups, localities, religious groups, even ideas of like the nation itself. Nationalism and folk music have often gone hand in hand if you look at a lot of nationalist movements throughout the world. Also, available technologies have a big impact on this sociology, this sort of matrix, I guess I'm describing, as do our economies. Like, we exist in a capitalist society, so that impacts greatly on sort of that musical cultural sociology, as you might call it. So again, it's never a simple one-way dynamic. Sometimes there are currents at certain layers that work sort of at 90-degree angles to other currents that sort of refract or increase the potency or diminish. So anyways, it's always a sort of a complicated thing to describe. So what I'm going to talk a lot about is the role that music plays in the production of memory and place, senses of place. And I want to, so yeah, I'll give just sort of just a brief foray into that. And to do that, I'm going to draw on an ethnomusicologist's article, Sarah Cohen, a British ethnomusicologist. She did a really nice article about popular and religious music in Liverpool's Jewish community. And I found it really helped me think about things I've seen in English-speaking Quebec as well. The name of that article, and I can send out links to any of this stuff after if you guys want, is called Sounding Out the City, Music in the Sensuous Production of Place, and that came out in 1995. I'm also going to draw a bit on some work I published in a Canadian journal, which was about how the sound of the fiddle and fiddle music is such a potent force, such sort of an emotional resource for English-speaking Gaspésians. And I drew on some other sort of sociological models. I'm not going to go super deep into that stuff, but I will draw from my own research a little bit there. So just before I continue, when I say place and the production of place, what I mean, I don't mean this in a strictly physical or geographic sense. I'm talking about this in kind of a conceptual, emotional sense, sort of in the ways that we think about places that are meaningful to us. And these could also be places, they could be places we've lived in temporarily, places we grew up, but they could also be places we've never been to that we've just imagined. You know, like when we listen to music depicting the Old West or, you know, sort of, I guess, Eastern cultures even. So this idea that music can help produce how we perceive places, both ones we've inhabited and ones that we haven't. So how is place produced in music? A lot can be said about this, but I'll just briefly talk about Sarah Cohen's article. And I'm just going to do a little quote here. She describes this production as, quote, a social practice involving relations between people, sounds, images, artifacts, and the material environment. So in her article, she interviewed an elderly Jewish man from Liverpool who talked about growing up in the 1920s and 30s at the onset of sort of the jazz and big band era. And, you know, this was a person that had gone to dances. He had even dabbled in playing jazz music, but basically he was just a listener. He was just someone that attended with a kind of religious fervor all these jazz clubs, which the Jewish community of Liverpool was really instrumental in sort of hosting. They were often owners of these clubs and were sort of movers and shakers in that world. And so what she sort of found out by interviewing him was that his entire sense of who he was and his community's story during that time in his formative years was bound up in the places where he and his peer group encountered, performed, and danced to music. And she describes this kind of the way that the music was encountered. These were very, what she calls sensuous environments. I know that word can be sort of misconstrued, but what she means is that these were environments where all the senses were engaged. You know, sound, obviously from the music, bodies, people packed close together in these clubs, people dancing, even the smells of these places, the food that was being cooked, all these things made like a very sensuous environment, and music was the pretext for these events. And so consequently, when she interviewed him 70 years later, he can recall with great clarity these moments where music was encountered. They gave him a very profound connection to that Jewish experience in Liverpool. His sense of his neighborhood and what it meant to be from that neighborhood was bound up in his sort of biography with music and music that was present in the 1920s and 30s. And this was true even though, you know, fast forward 70 years into the 1990s, Liverpool's Jewish community had dwindled considerably due to outmigration. Also upward mobility, people moving to more affluent suburbs as opposed to this working class Jewish neighborhood. Other people moved to Israel. So the community had dwindled. And I think just reading this, it made me think about the English-speaking community, or some of our English-speaking communities in Quebec, in particular the Jewish community of Montreal that was historically situated around the Plateau and Mile End, and who eventually moved to places like Côte Saint-Luc and the West Island, or just Ontario or Points West. Also the Black community in Little Burgundy, which, you know, Dorothy could correct me if I'm wrong later, but my understanding is that a lot of people moved out of that neighborhood for a number of reasons, which she could tell you more about, but to places like the West Island or maybe NDG, Lasalle, I'm not sure, but, you know, I saw a lot of resonances, all that to say, with Liverpool's Jewish community that was described. And then also these English-speaking communities, or also Yiddish in the case of the Jewish community, in Quebec, you know, where music was once a very prominent part of life. And a lot of, I would say, the collective memory of being part of those communities is bound up in musical experiences. So I think what was also neat in that article was that when that man in his, I think he would have been in his 70s or 80s then, would walk through the neighborhood during the 1990s, to walk through the neighborhood was to relive these moments of music and togetherness in his community. So, as I was reading that, I said, hey, I've done a lot of research on English speakers in Gaspé, and I wrote an article about the production of place that happens through music. And what I did was I considered fiddle music, and what I discovered was I was sort of asking, like, well, why is the sound of the fiddle so potent for Anglophone Gaspésians? Why does it provoke such a profound sense of home and missing home and, their heritage? And what the link I made was, in the case of Gaspésian culture, there's this practice of unsolicited visiting. So you can, even to this day in the English-speaking community, it's very normal to drop by without calling ahead. And it's been that way probably for centuries. It's something I had to get used to at first, but I really grew to enjoy it. And until I would say the 50s or 60s, music was just part of everyday life. One person told me that every home in her village just about had a fiddle or an organ, including homes where people didn't play music. Because what would happen is sometimes someone that played a bit of music would stop by on a visit, and you'd be asked to play a few tunes. And you generally indulge those requests. I've heard stories of an elderly fiddler being woken up at 3 a.m. With the neighborhood kids throwing pebbles at his window to get him to wake up so he could come down and play for them to dance to on the beach. This sort of kind of informality and the way that music just inhabited these everyday contexts, and the way it was just something that people had access to and appreciated in their everyday lives, I think had a lot to do with why fiddle music became such sort of a powerful sound for them. And I'm going to actually read a quote from my article here that a person in his 80s described to me over the phone when I was doing this. He's talking about these musical videos. And so I'm just going to read his quote. He says, "We used to go to Joe Sr.'s mother and I, going to visit her cousin in the second concession, and we'd pass right beside their door. And Mr. Joe, he would be maybe sawing wood, he might be doing carpenter work, he might have been out in the farm with the potatoes or working with his horse or whatever. And she'd say to him, 'Joe, you think you could come in and play me a tune?' And he'd stop for a little bit and he'd say, 'Well, Mary, yeah, I guess I could.' So he would drop whatever he was doing and he'd come in and play her maybe 2-3 tunes and he'd go about his business. And we'd leave on our business, And he'd never say no. That was Mr. Joe. And his brother Charlie, we were actually next field to them. We used to go down to Uncle Charlie's, we called him, every Mardi Gras. In Mardi Gras, all the villagers around the town would dress with masks on. And that time, it wouldn't be bought masks. It would be maybe a pillowcase or something we'd cut the eyes out of, that kind of thing. And we'd dress up, and you'd never put on your clothes you wore every day because people would recognize that. Now you're talking about 20, 25 below zero. And of course, we'd go down to Uncle Charlie's because everybody came in there. 'Oh, Mr. Drowdy, can you play us a tune?' And he'd put on his shoes and he'd play the violin. And every Mardi Gras, there were at least 3 or 4 step dancers would dance, And they came in with snow on their boots and, black boots. And his hardwood floor, the next day would not have been in real good condition. But that was always a laugh. And the Mi-Carême, which came about 3 weeks later in the middle of Lent, roughly, it would be the same thing again. So I just wanted to share you that quote. I think it gives you a sense of the kind of environments which in some of these English-speaking communities music was encountered. And, for Alfred, that was the fellow I was talking to, he now lives in Brampton, Ontario, but whenever he hears the sound of the fiddle, and it doesn't have to be, the sound, like people from Gaspé playing, it could be, a fiddle celebrity from Manitoba. When he hears that on his car CD player, I asked him, what do you think about when you hear fiddle? And he says, I think right away about Mr. Joe and Uncle Charlie, those 2 people he described there. And so it's really, for him, it's even though he doesn't play any music, it's an incredibly powerful, resource he has, to connect him to his Gaspésian heritage. So yeah, I think what I noticed is that, hanging out with people from Gaspé is, in their musical culture, a lot of effort went into finding music. Like he would have to walk through the fields. They were traveling by foot back then. Moving into the 1970s, there was a festival in the communities of Wakeham and York on the outskirts of Gaspé. And I've heard a story of a guy biking from Montreal to get back to the festival to hear the music. I've heard stories of, when one of the bands that was hired, when their, van broke down in Toronto, someone from Gaspé would call up their cousin in Toronto and they'd get their van out and drive this band, drive 20 hours right through the night to get to this festival. Also, a good friend of mine would drive most weekends from the Howick region, so it'd be about a 12, 13-hour drive. They drive right through for a house party at their cousins, and they would play all night and dance all night, jump back in the car and drive back to Howick, and the guy would go to work the next day. So these were people that invested a lot in their musical lives, including people that didn't even play, that just enjoyed it so much. So I kind of look to Gaspé as an example, but I think this kind of dynamic actually existed in a lot of our communities. I don't want to say it was universal, but I think it was an important part in our life, and it's part of our heritage. I think I'm glad QUESCREN is helping myself and these community groups take an opportunity to explore. So I'm just going to grab a glass of water here. So what is it about music as opposed to, say, other art forms that makes it especially important in the production of place? It's hard to summarize. It's a big subject. But if I would kind of go along one thread, what I would say is that music is often experienced sensuously, as Sarah Cohen described it, in these social contexts with family, friends, or in the community. And these are, again, like places where there's lots of movement, there's lots of maybe warmth, a sense of generosity. So what happens, like in my research and in Sarah Cohen's research, is that specific musics come to represent our memories and our feelings for these people and the communities long after we experience these. So in the case of English-speaking Quebec, where you can have a lot of out-migration or a lot of just whatever, you can look at the demographic phenomena in each specific community, but music still tends to be one of the things that gets the community out, that will pack a hall once a month with, happy spectators and dancers. And I've still found that to be true. I might be a little bit biased because I'm a musician, but I do feel that, when I go into the Chateauguay Valley, even Eastern Townships, Valcartier, West Quebec, time and time again, it was music, and music was often being used simultaneously to support local causes like food banks, helping out seniors and all this stuff. So I think, if you imagine if our musical culture is withered, then I think with it, a lot of that power we have, that sort of industriousness to rally for our communities, would also be lost. So I think what I'm looking for in my work in general, including in this project, is just for the English-speaking community leadership and community members to take stock of their community's musical resources and ask, is the milieu healthy? Are there performers, both professional and amateur? Are there venues, formal or just, domestic? Are there occasions for playing? Are there opportunities for youth and adults to develop as musicians? Are there mentors? Are there organizers, festivals? And beyond those resources, I would also ask, and this goes back to the beginning of my talk, is what are our musical values as a community? Do we see music as something more than just, something to add a bit of extra flavor to an existing event? Do we value it, and is it nourished in the community? Do we understand and leverage the fact that, like I said, in many of our communities, music seems to be one of the really ways where it's still easy to get the community together and out of their houses and to come together and experience a bit of cohesion. And from that, do we believe that our musicians, dancers, organizers, and venues have a core place in the vitality of our communities? So this is what I want to promote, is a sense that music matters for all of us, even for those of us for whom music might not be that important to us personally. Or perhaps we don't love the genres that people tend to play in our communities. There's a lot of country music that gets played in rural English-speaking Quebec, and not everyone loves country music, but just to still see that music and that are the way that the English-speaking community has appropriated commercial country music is valuable because it has a way of bringing the community together. I really see music as important as a collective resource, and I think it's an important player in any community's vitality, not just the English-speaking community. But This is where my work lies. So that's like the end of my formal presentation. I do have a couple examples I wouldn't mind playing, but I thought maybe I'd just ask Lorraine how we're doing for time. I was just going to show some of the stuff I collected. Lorraine, why don't you get on there and let me know if you want me to continue with that?
Well, it's about 25 to 1. We have till 1. So what, can you take 5 more minutes?
Sure. I'll give you yeah.
Just a spoiler to everyone, Glenn told me prior to this that someone might ask him during questions to play something and maybe he'll play. So that we'll save that for later.
Okay, so I believe my screen should be sharing now. I'm going to share you a clip I recorded in December at the Caribbean Paradise. It's the end of an evening showcasing youth musical talent through a mentor in that community called Todd Smith. His name's Todd Smith. Some of you might know him already. He's sort of a hip-hop artist, youth mentor. He works in the Lester P. Pearson School Board, and he had the kids up all night performing the original music, and at the end he does this freestyle. I'm just going to listen to a bit of that.
My name is Todd Smith. You guys were a great audience tonight. Thank you guys for coming out. We want to just end this off and just say a couple of words to y'all. It's a holiday season. A lot of people we lost. A lot of people we still will lose, but we are all right here right now. So everybody in this building right now, we got to make sure to stay tight, stay connected, keep building. And like these guys just said, it's greatness. This is how it goes. It's greatness, no fakeness. It's real. This is how it goes down, man. We holding no steel. I got 2 fists up. I'll knock you down real. It's like that. Willette Park, that's where I grew, dog. From 5 years old, 85 is what I knew, y'all. Cecil Newman School, that's what I'm rapping. And I went to Argyle Academy, I was stepping. That wasn't for done, they closed the school down. Cause guess what, man? Too much madness going around. And now I'm freestyling off the top of my head. I got these youngsters doing it, man. They doing it for real. Gift to you is what they brought tonight. And y'all came through, man. Yo, you showed some light. And yo, you showed some love. I got DJ Nas doing it right. We gonna rock the crowd. Miss Dabber teaching all these kids. Orchard to Lasalle Elementary is what she did, is what she lives. It's music, it's real things. This is how it goes down, man. You see me bling, big rings. Taman, I see your chain. Understand this, man. We run this gang. Lasalle, baby, the Ville. They call it Texas. Maybe you don't know why, but the shit was real, man. I'm talking back in the days on Dollard Street when big guns were blaring, man. We had to play hide and seek, because otherwise we would have got touched in our chest. But now I'm trying to show the youth that you can really be blessed. Put the guns down, put the knives down too. Pick up the books, man, do what you want to do. Stay focused, man, get educated in school. Don't be a fool, man, do what you got to do. This is the show we brought in 2019. It's called Gift to You. Tebby J, JX, Just Malka 2. We got Juan, Young Vanessa got the sauce. 2020, we all stepping like some balls. This is what it is. Todd Smith, Gift to You, Caribbean Paradise. I cannot thank you guys enough for coming down tonight. DJ Nas, drop that. We're going to have a good party, man. Stick around.
So, I guess, like a few comments about that. Why I thought that was important. What is Todd doing there when he freestyles? He's sort of lyrically marking places and times in his history in LaSalle, his relationship to the kids. He talks about this idea of coming together, being together. I think like these moments where the youth and someone like Todd and, all their family members were there at the Caribbean Paradise restaurant on Newman Boulevard in LaSalle. A plug for that restaurant. This restaurant is a place where a lot of the events in the Black community happen these days. And I just think that was sort of a wonderful example, whether or not you like hip hop or freestyling or whatever. I think people like Todd, who are in the schools mentoring our youth, encouraging their creativity and all this are such important people. So that's what I have to say about Todd. I guess I'm going to play a bit of music here. Let's go to West Quebec. I was there in December, and I would say West Quebec really impressed me. It's, around Wakefield, Chelsea, there's just so much artistic talent, and there's a lot of reasons for that with like trends of people moving there from other places, as well as an older English-speaking community. But there's just a lot of appreciation for music and the arts. I would say, again, it's bound up in any community cause. And what one of the people I interviewed described to me was that, if there's a concert at the Hebrew restaurant in Wakefield on a Wednesday night, all the musicians in Wakefield and Chelsea will be there to support it. You know, it's got that kind of grassroots feel to it. So I wanted to play a song from actually a well-known Canadian singer-songwriter, folk singer that he began in the late 60s, 70s. His name is Ian Tamblyn. He lives in Chelsea. He's released like 40 albums. He's super prolific, but he's also just really involved in the grassroots musical culture of his area. And he wrote this song, which is about local history, recent local history, when the covered bridge in Wakefield burned down. So he wrote this song on his album here called Angel Share. And let's play it and have a listen.
And there was no good reason to rebuild that bridge, for the road had been rerouted long ago. The talk of the fire just rekindled old flames that had scarred the town along the Gatineau. Just a red-covered bridge where green waters glide on a picture-perfect day in fall. It was the kind of scene that once recalled a time and a place where time stood still. But to look up that river, not see it there, was a picture of a world not right. For that bridge had found a place in all of nature's grace, in the hearts of those who lived upon the banks. There's no good reason to rebuild that bridge, but then reasons often why a thing's not done. So from smoke and ashes, a deeper flame now burned, and from that flame a new bridge was begun. That bridge was made of bake sales, banquets, auctions to high benefits, and even songs were sung. Time they said, please don't quit. Other time, to hell with it. Looking up, one day the job was done. Just a red-covered bridge in the mist and the snow. On a winter's day I came to know it was built for beauty, for the love of the thing. That bridge across the Gatineau. It was built for the beauty, for the love of the thing. That bridge across the Gatineau. It was built for the beauty, for the love of the thing. That bridge across the Gatineau.
Okay, so where that song is going is he's talking about, you know, this community that lost their covered bridge, and it really served no purpose anymore. The highway had long bypassed that difficult bend in the Gatineau River, but it was just such a part of the community's, I guess, identity and sense of place. So he wrote the song to commemorate that, and what they did when it burned down, even though the bridge had ceased being useful, they decided to build it again. And they raised money at bake sales, you know, benefits, and what was propelling a lot of that sort of grassroots movement were like these musicians in this community who helped, you know, raise like, I don't know, millions of dollars to rebuild a very long, beautiful covered bridge over the Gatineau River. And look up a picture of that if you are, especially our Eastern Townships people. I know a lot of us love covered bridges. So anyways, I guess I could share lots of music. We do have a YouTube channel if you search A Different Tune, and maybe you have to add Quebec to that too. There's a blog, a differenttune.blog, and a Facebook page. I'm sure you'll be able to find us if you search A Different Tune. And the idea is to really share the stories and the music of this community. So just to finish, I'll say, you know, thanks to QUESCREN for supporting this project. It's really great to feel that, you know, we're going to take the time to see what the the role of music is in our communities, and also Canadian Heritage, who have funded this. So I'll end right there. Thanks so much for having me today.
Thank you, Glenn. I will now turn the floor to the people in the room, in our virtual room. If someone has a question or comment, would you just write it in chat? So again, I'll refer you to the icon on the bottom of your screen that says chat. It has a little talk bubble. If you have a question or comment, please just say, I've got it, want to talk, and then I'll create a speakers list. So far, I don't see any. So I have some questions. Glenn, I wonder, a lot of what you talked about was quite traditional, and then you had the freestyler. Would you say the same thing goes in general about not just older music, but much more recent music in terms of creating that sense of space, place, and belonging?
It's a great question. I think it's something that a lot of people, especially in the heritage sector, wonder about, like, what is musical heritage, what isn't it? I'm not a person that, I believe heritage is something we assign retrospectively, often once something is kind of gone. You know, fiddle music was the popular music for Gaspésians before radio came in. So I don't make a great distinction. Of course, each music, I think, has you know, things it's good at. I see Matthew on the waiting list. I don't know if it's Matthew Farfan. Anyhow,
I'm keeping the list. Don't worry.
Okay, cool. Anyways, yeah, I think the same things. You know, every culture has its own dynamics, and youth culture, I think we need to embrace it. And, you know, that's definitely, hip hop is part of youth culture, you know, in the Black community especially, but even more generally. And, you know, I was going to show you a video of a young singer-songwriter from Wakefield. She's 12. She started writing songs a month ago, but, you know, she writes in sort of like the indie pop vein, but she's writing songs about her experiences in Wakefield, the place, the people she knows there. So, yeah, I think, you know, what's really important is that sensuous production of place with music. So encountering music played by people in our communities in social contexts, you know, that's I think really all that matters. And the rest, you know, are just details. But it's a great question, Lorraine. Thank you.
Thanks, Glenn. We have a question from Christina at QUAHN. Christina, so Anna, if you could unmute the QUAHN.
Hi, everyone. So, Glenn, I'm really, I think it's really interesting to see how some communities really come together more than others around music. And so I'm interested to know if you've identified common traits among these communities. Like you mentioned, you know, Wakefield has a really strong network of musicians and people who support musicians. And so, yeah, my question being, what are the common traits between these communities? Like, how do we identify a community that has a strong support and participation in their local music scene?
Right. I'll make kind of a generalization. So I think you can definitely make some generalizations about our rural communities, for whom music in the past, until probably about the 60s, but even to the present in many contexts, is just still part of everyday life. Like, someone has an uncle that plays, or an aunt that, you know, plays piano in church, or sings in the choir. I would say our rural communities tend to have that, and kind of what I think it kind of comes down to, I hate to make it about this, but I think class has a lot to do with it. Generally, as people tend to move into more middle class lifestyles, you know, music becomes less important. Work and being an industrious, productive member of society take on more importance. I'm generalizing hugely there, but I would say, you know, like, that's why in like suburban communities, you'll see that, you know, I mean, they have a lot of other things going on for them, but music might not play as prominent a role as it does in the rural communities. Also, yeah, there's so many, you know, English-speaking Quebec is so diverse. I want to give a counterpoint to that thing about class, because what I will say is we have, if any of you guys know the scene in Quebec City, with like Simon Jacobs, our former president, there's quite a high participation of the English-speaking community in the local symphony. And I would say, like, there's a strong, like, formal arts scene there. So I think class is important, but it doesn't determine everything, but it can sort of shape. And that's what I found, is that the biggest commonality are between our rural communities, where there's kind of a grassroots sort of kitchen party aesthetic to the music. Yeah, the great question. Thank you.
Thank you. Dwayne Wilkin from Quan wrote a couple of things. Dwayne, did you want me to read your question, or do you want to say it yourself? Dwayne?
His mic go ahead and I can. Oh, I have to mute, unmute myself?
We hear you.
Okay. No, it was really more a couple of observations, Glenn. Thank you for the presentation, by the way. What I was thinking when you were talking about the differences between cultures and communities is how music bridges and influences cultures and communities as well. And so it becomes kind of difficult, I think, over time to distinguish between a Gaspésian tradition versus a Western Quebec tradition, if you're talking about, say, fiddle music. Or for that matter, the way that jazz was performed in Little Burgundy in the 1950s by the composers that some of whom we've all heard of, like Oscar Peterson, and the way it's performed today, perhaps not even by Black performers, but by white performers. This is a feature of music. There is this constant evolution, is a constant cross mixing. So as a student, as a musicologist, this must present you with a lot of challenges in trying to unravel and untangle this heritage.
It is, especially if you're interested in the history of it. I would say I tend to lean, ethnomusicology tends to be inspired by anthropology a lot. So I'm not actually super concerned about the formal aspects of music, the specific sounds. I'm more interested in what communities do with them, so how we use them. And heritage does move. I mean, this is something that's come up in heritage studies. I think, if you look at until the 1990s, the idea was that heritage was a very fixed, bounded thing. It starts and stops, and it looks like this, and it doesn't include this. Most scholars have moved away from that kind of mentality. And I mean, I tend to just talk about culture, and there's cultures that have more sort of a pastness to them and some that are more in the present. But there's always an interaction and a flow, and people move and music moves. Music's always been on the move. It's always, traveled with people, even going back to medieval society with like bards and stuff, people that would go town to town. So I think we have that's part of that heritage too. But yeah, music is very porous, and it doesn't tend to stick with one community. So yeah, like I'm saying, if I encounter, even like talking to Todd, like a few of the youth performers at his hip hop showcase were white, or I think one was Latino, but he doesn't distinguish between them. I mean, some people might, but like they were still his people and part of his scene. So I find community members are more Catholic about this than the people that work in the field. So anyways, thank you for that question. I hope I answered it. It is a big topic, but thanks for asking it, Dwayne.
We have a question from Patrick Donovan.
Hi, Glenn. I'm interested in hybridity of cultures. Now, you mentioned earlier Mardi Gras and mi-carême, which are French traditions that have been sort of, taken on by the English community in the Gaspé. Do you have any, other examples of that kind of hybridity in terms of the music itself? Like, how French exactly is the music itself in English-speaking Quebec?
Well, I can speak to Gaspé. It's the thing to know about this is nothing was written about this music in Gaspé at all until the 1940s, and it was written by an early generation of folklorists who had a certain bias. They were the first folklorists that went to Gaspé were interested in ancient French songs. So consequently, even though the English-speaking population was significant at the time, these people wouldn't have collected songs from English-speaking singers. They would have encountered them and known them, but that wasn't interesting material. So we don't know that much, but what I will say is my first impressions when I first heard Gaspésian fiddling was that, my God, this is the Frenchest music I've ever heard. It has the seated foot percussion, all the markers of the Québécois style, what we now call Québécois style. And yeah, so there was, I think the thing is to look at is not music or even the mi-carême. That really comes from the Catholic tradition. You find that all over the Catholic world. You find that down in Latin America, but you also find it in Newfoundland, and even in Protestant England, there are like Mardi Gras traditions. They don't always happen at the same time. Or I'm thinking of Parang in Trinidad, very similar sort of traditions associated with Lent and that whole period. So yeah, there is hybridity. And definitely, I would say to think about music as always a dialogue, and it's never one way. So even though, I might identify Gaspésian fiddling as being super French, it's hard to say what came first, because the fact is, we actually, if you look at the fiddle music in Quebec, we don't actually play dance forms that come from France. We play dance forms like reels and jigs, which come from Scotland and Ireland. And the Irish community in Gaspé goes back to the 1780s. The English-speaking community goes back to the 1760s. So I think it's always been a two-directional flow, rather than being passed from one group to another. But super hybrid, especially out there. I think when you get to West Quebec and the closeness to Ontario, you don't find it sounding quite as quintessentially Québécois. But that's normal for its milieu. Whereas in Gaspé, they were super isolated, and the communities cohabitated the same space for 2.5 centuries. So yeah. Thank you, though. Great question.
I have nobody else on our list, which gives us 5 minutes with 2 to close for Glenn to play something.
Put me on the spot here.
If you want. You did say you would, right?
I did say I would. I'm just wondering if I'm bold enough to play the accordion, which I've only been learning the last 4 years. So it's a bit of a gamble. Are. And I'm a little rusty. I've been working on this project the last month. But I thought, well, in case I screw it up, I want to do a plug for this amazing CD from the communities of Valcartier and Shannon, I think from about 2010. It's now out of print, but if you contact St. Gabriel, the Valcartier Heritage Committee, they can probably find a copy. It's 2 elderly musicians on there, an accordionist named Keith Corrigan and a singer-fiddler named Jimmy Kelly, and it's a mixture of songs and accordion tunes. And I thought I'd play a tune from that disc. They had a set dance, a 5-part set dance called the Lancers, that had specific tunes that went to it. So this is the I'm gonna try to do the second tune in that Lancers set. Where am I? So that's the accordion segment of the show. Thanks for bearing with me.
Christina asked you to say a word about the accordion you're playing.
Oh, good question. This is an accordion made in Montmagny, Quebec. Quebec has a tradition of master builders of these one-row button accordions. His name is Marcel Messervier. And this accordion belonged to a friend of mine's grandfather. He was from Lévis. His name was Antonio Couture. It's a beautiful accordion. I'm super lucky to have it, and I only have it because I knew the family. A lot of other people wanted it after Antonio died, but I ended up with it. So I'm thankful for it every day. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you. We are coming to the end of our hour. I wanted to say a sincere thank you to Glenn Patterson for sharing your thoughts, your research, your music, your project with QAHN. It's so rich and fantastic and very useful to everyone, as well as nice. Thank you. I also want to thank the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network for working with us to get this event together in record time. These lunch and learns, Glenn mentioned one that Dorothy did last couple weeks ago. They started through a simple effort to have Zoom lunches for QUESCREN staff to keep it together as we work in separate homes. Then we started inviting a couple of friends. Then I thought we could see what Dorothy's up to. So this is just evolving step by step. And we'll keep doing these. I think it's a good idea for many reasons. And so I think the next time we'll start sending it to our general QUESCREN list. So if any of you do not subscribe to the QUESCREN newsletter, please go to our website, QUESCREN.ca should get you there. Or you can try it on the Concordia website. Maybe someone can put that up on the chat. And sign up for our newsletter, because I'm kind of compiling a list of people to send out the invitations to, and I don't think I always remember to include everyone if I have to update a link or whatever. So thank you again, and we look forward to seeing people in maybe 3 or 4 weeks for the next one. Glenn, any last words, because we've got a couple minutes left before 1 o'clock.
No last words other than just to thank everyone for joining. Great to be so supported. I could play a little fiddle tune if you wanted to, as you sort of leave the meeting, you know, I could give you some atmospheric music.
Yes, and I would also invite everyone, if they want, to put their video on, just to see who's there and say a kind of hello to each other as we end our hour.
All right. Thanks so much, guys. I'll play a tune called Eva Drowdy's tune, just named after a woman from Douglastown who now lives in Dorval. It comes from Charlie Drowdy, who we talked about earlier.
Thank you. And I will say thank you to everyone. A round of applause for Glenn.
Oh, Glenn, it was great.
Thank you, Sandra. Take care.
Thank you. And we'll see you next time. Bye, everyone. We're signing out now.